Okay, next up, circulation and gas exchange. So there are different ways that animals can get the things they need. Here with this cnidarian, this jellyfish, they have a water vascular system with a single opening, so they don't have a blood or anything. They just draw water in. Circulates around the body, taking oxygen and nutrients to the cells around the body, and then waste come back out the same opening. Pretty simple system. Many organisms, though, do have a more advanced or type of circulatory system. Some with an open circulatory system like insects where there is a heart and there's some vessels, but the blood as it is, known as hemolymph, sort of moves through the body, nourishing the cells, gathering waste, and then being drawn back into the heart. Whereas in us and many other animals, they have a closed circulatory system in which the blood is restricted to the blood vessels. You have capillary beds that have very thin walls, finely branched vessels that allow for the exchange of materials in and out of the blood from the cells. When you have a closed circulatory system, you can have different kind of hearts, from the fish that has a two-chambered heart to the amphibian with a three-chambered, a reptile with a four-chambered heart that has sort of a partial connection between the two sides, and then in mammals we have the four-chambered heart where everything is separate. Notice in the fish that as blood circulates around the body, it only goes through the heart once, where in these others, as it circulates around the body, it goes through the heart twice. So these guys have double circulation, which makes their systems a bit more efficient, because after the blood has received oxygen and goes back to the heart, it's forced out again, so it's that oxygenated blood is sent with a lot of pressure throughout the body, whereas here, in the fish, after it's received oxygen, it's not going back through the heart and having more pressure put on it, so it doesn't quite get around with the same intensity as with these other guys. Now notice here in the amphibian there's a bit of mixing between the low oxygen and high oxygen blood. Less so here in the reptile, and none at all in the mammal, because again the two sides of the heart are completely separate from each other. So here's the mammalian heart again, double circulation. I won't go through all these terms here, but you should pretty much keep these in mind, and note again that we have arteries leaving the heart and veins coming back. Not all arteries have lots of oxygen. The aorta does, but the pulmonary arteries do not. They're low in oxygen going to the lungs. Note, pulmonary circulation is to and from the lungs. The rest is known as systemic circulation. Up close and personal on the heart. So blood flows into the atriums, then it flows down to the ventricles. Notice the thick muscular walls of the ventricles, able to, when they constrict, to force the blood out of the heart with a lot of pressure. You have the valves that keep the blood flowing in one direction, the atrioventricular valves here between the atrium and the ventricles, and the semilunar valves that for the arteries that are leaving the heart. The cardiac cycle controls the beating of the heart, in which you have blood flowing into the atriums and then into the ventricles. As the ventricles begin to contract, that forces the atrioventricular valves close, forces blood out of the atriums. And then once the atriums begin to relax, that will cause the semilunar valves to close and the atrioventricular valves to open, drawing more blood back in, and the cycle just continues, etc. And you see the whole cycle is only about a second or so, depending on how active a person is and how healthy they are. We want to note that the sinoatrial node is known as the heart's pacemaker. It's a cluster of muscle cells up at the right atrium that begins this nerve impulse that first causes the atriums to contract, and then that nerve impulse is sent down these things called the bundle branches, and then these things called the Purkinje fibers that branch off of them that causes the impulse to be sent to the ventricles, and those ventricles contract, and forcing, again, blood out the arteries. Here's an image, a little piece of what you would see from an ECG, an electrocardiogram, that shows what's happening in the cardiac cycle. As we talked about in class, we said how the insides of these muscle cells normally have a negative charge and they're positive on the outside, and that is they're polarized. So this down low is negative, up high is positive. So what happens as these muscles are stimulated and begin contracting, they are rapidly depolarized, and that causes the contraction, or the signal causes them to be too polarized, which stimulates contraction. And so this first little wave here represents the atria contracting, and then this big spike here represents the ventricles contracting, as you can see here, which is this rapid depolarizing of the cells. And then it quickly comes back down or repolarizes at the end of the cardiac cycle. And this little spike here, or this little hill, is when the ventricles are relaxing. Now, arteries and veins. Arteries have thicker muscular walls because there's more pressure. Veins have thinner muscle walls because there's less pressure. They have valves in them to keep the blood flowing. Because there's less pressure, it tends not to flow as rapidly in the veins compared to the arteries. Capillaries. In the capillaries, there's a lot more surface area compared to arteries and veins. This makes sense for the exchange of materials. Blood slows down rapidly in the arteries, speeds back up a little bit on the vein side of the system. Note here the higher pressure on the arterial side of the system, less on the vein side, and how it bounces around up here. That's the systolic and the diastolic pressure. So the systolic is when those ventricles are contracting and forcing blood out, high pressure. And then the dip, the diastolic pressure, is when, in that moment in time when the heart is relaxing and the arterial blood is not under as much pressure. Because of this up and down, if an artery is severed, the blood will come squirting out with each beat of the heart, whereas when veins are severed or cut, the blood just kind of slowly oozes out. When you donate blood, you tap into veins, not arteries, because you don't want that blood under so much pressure. You don't want it coming out rapidly. You want it to come out much slower rate. When blood flows into capillary beds, again, it's under pressure. This, because of the thin cell walls of our capillaries, this forces liquid out of the blood, essentially the plasma. And so the blood loses some of its volume as it's going through the capillary beds. Now, towards the far end of the capillary beds, where there's much less pressure, it reabsorbs some of that liquid. But there is a net outflow of liquid from the system. Here's blood, consisting of the liquid part, the plasma, and the cell part. The plasma being mostly made of water, but having a lot of solutes dissolved in it, lots of ions, proteins, and other materials, some of the waste materials, the oxygen and CO2 that's dissolved in the blood, hormones coming from the endocrine system, the cells, the red cells, the white cells, and the platelets. Red cells, lots of them carrying oxygen. White cells, or the leukocytes, helping with the immune system, fighting off pathogens. We'll see that later in that chapter. Platelets, helping with blood clotting, these clustering near areas where you have cuts. So with the respiratory system, so the respiratory system and the circulatory system interact to bring oxygen in and get rid of CO2, providing oxygen for, of course, cellular respiration, taking away the CO2 that's a waste product of cellular respiration. So that respiratory surface is in our lungs, connected to our mouth, obviously, through the trachea. So you have the trachea coming down, branching off into these two bronchi, or bronchi, and then branching off into finer bronchioles, and then finally entering At the cul-de-sacs of the lungs, the alveoli, which you can see are surrounded by capillaries, the oxygen poor blood coming in, absorbing oxygen, leaving the lungs as oxygen-rich blood, also bringing with it CO2 that then is deposited in the lungs that we breathe out. Below the lungs you have this muscle, the diaphragm. That combined with your rib muscles help with breathing so that the lungs expand when you're breathing in, they contract when you're breathing out. That expansion of the lung essentially pulls air in, and the contraction of the lungs forces air out. Back to homeostasis and feedback. So when your body, when you start to exercise, then you start to produce more CO2 in your cells, which changes the pH of your blood. That serves as a signal to your brain that says, oh, I'm exercising more because there's more CO2 and the pH of the blood has changed, so we need to breathe faster to get more oxygen in and get that CO2 out. So you have these mechanisms that increase the breathing rate and increase the heart rate, relaxation of the arteries to get the blood flowing through faster. And so it's a nice little system that, again, we don't have to think about. It just does it on its own. So you can see here the blood flowing around. We'll start over here. So we have this relatively low oxygen blood. It's come from the body, all those capillaries. A lot of the oxygen's been taken out. You can see it's pretty low. CO2 is fairly high. So we get to the lungs. You can see that the amount of oxygen is much higher there, so we'll absorb oxygen, but we'll release CO2. So the inhaled air is rich in oxygen. We absorb it. It's relatively low in CO2 compared to what's inside your lungs. So you release that CO2, so the air you breathe out is lower in oxygen, richer in CO2. And so then, of course, it travels back to the heart, to the left atrium, left ventricle, now through systemic flow, through all those capillaries, rich in oxygen, going to those cells, giving up oxygen, taking in CO2, etc., etc. Notice how the air you exhale is not completely deficient in oxygen. It still has a fair amount of oxygen in it. That's beneficial when it comes to something like CPR. So when you're breathing for someone else, you are breathing air into them that has oxygen in it. It would not be very useful if you were breathing into them air that was overly rich in CO2 and not much oxygen. You'd asphyxiate them then. Okay, so that's it for the circulatory system and respiration.